Call our meeting to order this morning, and we'll start out with a roll call. Rich?
Good morning. Chairman Representative Kelly, present in person. Vice Chair Representative Hoheisel, present in person. Ranking Minority Member Representative Shue, present in person. Representative Anderson is present in person. Representative Baker is present in person. Representative Bergkamp is present in person. Representative Day is present in person. Representative Donahoe is present in person. Representative Finney is present. She is remote. Good morning. Representative Kessler is present in person. Representative Lynn is present in person. Representative Neely is present in person. Representative Poskin is present and she is remote. Good morning. Representative Samsel. Representative Topliker. Representative Wassinger is present in person. Representative Weigel is present in person.
Thank you, Rich, very much. Today, in our meeting, we're going to go and look at something in the rural development area. And then we had a contact from KDHE that Dr. Norman would like to present a vaccine update to our committee. Since I suppose that all of you young folks in our committee that are still down the list and have friends down the list to get the shots, they want to tell you what's going on. Those old folks are already been watching that for a while as far as getting the shot. But we'll have those two things today. We will have, once you know, we've got 3 bills, hopefully, that will move forward that we can work with in the second half, and I think maybe a couple more that will come to us from the Senate that have the possibility. So we'll have some things to do in the second half also. But everything that we passed out, I think, has made it, one will be up for a final action today, but all the rest of them have made it out and are in various stops along the way. So we will look forward to that. In our opening presentation this morning, we have Christy Davis, a community advocate. Representative Baker was instrumental in getting Christy lined up. She is very active in redevelopment in rural communities, has a couple programs and suggestions in those programs that our committee could look at. And in the areas that she's worked, has made a real difference in some of the looks of downtowns and buildings in those communities. So I'm looking forward to hearing Christy, getting her idea on a couple of programs that can be used in rural areas and maybe can be used better with some changes to think about. So I would like to welcome to committee Christy Davis, and she will give us kind of real policy recommendations looking at redevelopment and other ideas. So welcome to the committee, Christy.
You got to turn the mic on. That's kind of a big deal. All right. Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I appreciate your time today. I want to start by saying that no one's paying me to be here. I'm not a lobbyist. I live in Cottonwood Falls, population 900, and my husband and I own a laundromat there. We also own a building in downtown Council Grove that has begun to spur some economic development there. I've seen development from all angles. I've worked in rural, urban, and suburban communities for about 25 years. And I'm very interested. I've begun to apply some of the lessons that I've learned working in urban areas in particular to rural communities, and I've seen some of the challenges that come with that. So That's why I bring these recommendations to you today. So you probably, I'm not going to read every detail of my statement here, but I think one of the important things that I'd like to say from the intro here is that you all know this, many of the rural communities that we work with, I think at least probably 75% of the rural communities throughout the state don't have professional staff, let alone lobbyists, who can bring these issues to you, let alone people in their communities who are actively developing their downtowns or see themselves as developers. So it is a very different approach. The good news is that there's a new generation of folks who are ready to step up and invest their time in these rural communities, regardless of the challenges. I'm thrilled to be among those. I was at a county commission meeting yesterday. I was telling Representative Baker a moment ago, where we had about, 60 to 70 people show up. Most of them were younger than me, which it made me very happy in Morris County. And they were there in support of some, maintaining some incentives for downtown development. So that is beginning to happen, but this new generation is facing huge challenges, including decades of depopulation and disinvestment. So folks who are investing in rural communities, they want to be there, they want to invest. The challenge is they're having to invest a lot more because of disinvestment over time. Working in rural communities is different. Large cities have an entire infrastructure devoted to attracting new businesses. They have paid economic development staff. They can offer an array of local incentives to spur investment. And although our state's rural communities can offer, quality of life and quaint atmosphere, and especially in these times with the pandemic, those are attracting investment and those are attracting new residents. They don't have the same economic development infrastructure. So, and no paid staff to help guide people through that, through what does exist at the state level. So we have these folks in rural communities who are facing an uphill battle, not only because there aren't incentives for redevelopment in these communities, but also because they're battling the naysayers. In a small community, everybody knows everybody's business, and you have to be willing to just put your blinders on and do it, and not expect a pat on the back. But it sure does help if there's incentives there to make it happen. So I've spent about 25 years working on redevelopment throughout the state. I grew up in a town of 1,100. Again, I live in a town of 900. I'm very passionate about redeveloping these communities, and I'm excited about the things that are happening, but we just need a little bit of a nudge. So my recommendations, I laid out 4 different programs. One program is the Historic Tax Credit Program. About 20 years ago, we in Kansas passed a state rehab tax credit that helps leverage actually funding through the federal rehab tax credit program as well. At that time, Missouri, our neighbors to the east, had one of the most progressive rehab tax credit programs in the country, and so we were in a situation where we were competing with that. So we were fortunate to get that program initiated at that time. But what I've seen personally, very personally, you'll see I put numbers on the page. Project that I finished in 2019 was a redevelopment of a historic bank building in downtown Council Grove. Most of that building had been vacant for 40 years. So as you can imagine, it required a lot of investment. I had to walk away from about $150,000 that a developer in a city would have had access to, because my project was considered small for the people who invest in these projects. The other issue that came up related to that, and I can provide more detail if you have questions later, but the other issue that is related to that is there's so little redevelopment going on in small rural communities that appraisers don't even know how to appraise the properties so that you can get the financing you need to do the project. So what happens then is people who would ordinarily invest in, for instance, federal rehab tax credits, they're afraid to. They're taking a huge risk that they wouldn't be taking in an urban area because the numbers aren't there to justify it. And also, because of all the paperwork that's involved, they can't always make it work with what they consider a small project. And I've asked some of these investors, what a small project is these days, and it depends on who you ask. Some of them say under 10 million, some of them may say under 40 million. If someone gave me 40 million bucks, I could rehab the entire downtown Council Grove. So those are the kinds of challenges of scale that we face in rural communities. Right now, there's an enhanced state rehab tax credit for nonprofits that's equal to 30% of qualified rehab expenditures. Whether you're in a rural community or an urban community, for an income-producing property, your rehab tax credit is equal to 25%. I'm suggesting that for communities, which I define differently than the federal government defines a rural community as under, what, 50,000? There's 8 communities in the entire state that have a population of more than 50,000. I'm suggesting looking at communities that have under 10,000 or under 5,000 population. Those are the ones that don't have the ability to have a local incentive or an infrastructure for redevelopment. And again, I'm happy to answer questions on that at the end. Neighborhood Revitalization Act. In 1994, the state legislature passed enabling legislation that created a property tax abatement for improvements in properties. And what that did was it allowed counties and also cities to identify areas that were in distress and provide a property tax abatement. It doesn't mean that the county is laying out cash to incentivize these projects. It means that they appraise your property before the project starts. You put in a significant investment. Many of these communities require at least $25,000, which for some communities is a lot. And then you pay your property taxes and you get a rebate for the difference. So I've been very transparent about my projects. I took advantage of Neighborhood Revitalization Act on the project that I mentioned in Council Grove. Just for issue of scale, I put in about 20 times the amount of money that I paid for the building. And it'll probably take me 20 years to get to the point where I could actually sell it. That's the kind of investment these projects are taking. But there's value in particular in these downtowns because they're authentic and that's what makes small towns great. So every year, in order to get my rebate, I have to pay about $14,000 in property taxes, which means I have to find $14,000, which is a lot of money. I could buy 2 buildings for that, and then wait for a rebate. So essentially, I'm loaning the county money in hopes of getting a rebate down the line. So one of the things I started thinking about was, is this, because you can't go to the bank and say, I want to borrow money to pay my property taxes. I guess you could, but they might laugh at you. And so it got me thinking, is there a way to make changes to this program where you don't have to pay upfront? Right now, I've got, after I rehabbed the bank building in downtown Council Grove, there are 4 or 5 new projects that are beginning to start in that area, and they're facing the same challenge. You all know this in many of our rural communities, because so much of the property is ag-related, the tax burden really falls on commercial property owners. And in many of these counties, the average per capita property tax is like, $2,000. It's really high anyway, even just for residential, but the commercial business owners are carrying a huge burden, in part because we're trying to maintain an infrastructure that was meant for a larger population. Many of the projects that I've been involved in over the years involve rehabbing historic buildings or other properties for housing, and we all know that there's a housing need in rural communities. Right now, many of our communities, because of COVID, are seeing an increase in population. I'm pretty excited about what's happening. There's new people moving in. They don't want to live in a city. They can work anywhere, and why not live in the most beautiful place on the planet, rural Kansas? So what's happening is we need housing for them, and there's a huge boom that happened over the summer where you didn't even have to put your house on the market. These houses were selling before they were listed. And at one time I was looking for a place for some friends of mine in my community, and we couldn't find anything. I'd like to redevelop more housing. One of the projects that I have, one of the properties I have has just one unit. It's a one-bedroom unit. One of them has 5 units, and I have a waiting list. I mean, I could be housing more people in downtown Council Grove and elsewhere if we could make the housing programs work for rural communities. And what I'm hearing, I don't do huge projects. I don't play that game, but what I'm hearing from the developers who do the huge projects, like develop abandoned school buildings, do very large rehab projects, is that they're having some challenges with the funding that's available for housing. Heritage Trust Fund, that's a program that was established, I believe, in 1990. It's a fee-funded program, and it's very specifically related to historic buildings. For instance, I've been using Council Grove a lot. That's where I've been working lately, but I've worked in all 105 counties in the state, by the way. But in downtown Council Grove, there's a historic district, and properties that contribute to that district qualify for preservation-related funding. That program, and most of what they fund are roofs, kind of a big deal. I mean, it might cost 30 to 40. You might get a building for $5,000, but you have to put a $30 to $40,000 roof on, as an example. Roofs, windows, building envelope type projects. That program is great for that type of work, in particular on historic buildings. That fee fund has remained stagnant for 30 years. So they have the same amount of money every year as they've had for 30 years. In the past, that was funded through mortgage registration fees. It was a penny on every 26 cents of fees. That was changed a few years ago. When I first started thinking about this, that funding calculation hadn't changed, and my thought was, if there was a way to double that, that fee to kind of keep up with inflation, that would help a lot. And then perhaps looking at match requirements, again, in most of these projects, there's a 50-50 match requirement for income-producing properties. For non-income producing properties, it's 80-20. And what I'm suggesting is, if we could enhance that, that fee fund, we could have reserves enough to change that matching requirement for rural communities where they're already behind, to do projects like, basic projects like roofs and windows, which affect not only individual property owners, but in a downtown setting, also affect adjacent buildings. I mean, I'm working on a lot of projects where we're investing a lot of money, and you're just hoping that people next door keep their roof maintained. I did one project where, as a nice favor, I own a building, and for the adjacent property owner, I installed new guttering on their building to protect mine, but they don't maintain it. And so it creates challenges. So those are just some of the recommendations. Again, I've been working on these for years. Obviously, this affects the work that I do. I'm not planning on taking on any new projects anytime soon because I'm subsidizing what I've got. But I'm very excited to see, especially younger people moving into rural communities and making these investments, but they don't have the red carpet treatment that they're getting in urban communities, and these are some things that could help with that. I would be happy to entertain any questions.
Thank you, Christy. Question from Representative Wessinger.
I'm sorry, I'm going to ask, I think, a lot of questions, if I may, Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. I have to get closer to the microphone. Can you tell me, what are the fees for the Heritage Trust? I know that we stopped taking mortgage registration.
Right now, they're based on, and I'm still trying to sort it out exactly, but right now, they're based on a per page, they're based on the number of pages that someone files when they file a mortgage. And I'll be honest, I've worked with this program for 25 years, and I don't understand how the fees are collected currently. It changed a few years ago, and it's based on the number of pages that are filed instead of so much per 26 cents.
And I guess I didn't realize that. I should know that, having a title.
It changed just a couple of years ago.
Okay. The other question I had was, have you ever sat down with anyone here in the legislature, such as someone like Representative Baker, to bring these to life with the revisor's office into a bill?
I have not, I have shared with Representative Baker the current statutes and markups. I'm not an attorney and I'm not a lobbyist, but I have shared the current statutes with markups that would make these changes possible.
I guess that's it. Thank you.
Any other questions, Dan? Christy, a question. And now, I've worked with historic tax credits in the past and currently have a project going for the bank I work for in Independence. And you talk about the amounts. Is there anything that can be done to enhance the market of the tax credits in rural communities that would help projects like yours in Council Grove? Or
Well, there's a group of bankers, mostly not community bankers, who invest in the federal credits. With the state rehab credits, those are transferable. And so it's not hard to find a buyer for those, which is helpful because people like me, especially in rural, you don't have a lot of income tax liability, especially in the first few years when you're building any business, let alone one in rural Kansas. But the federal tax credits are allocated based on an ownership percentage. And so in order to participate in that program, you need to find a true investor who's a part owner in your project, who has a tax liability. And the challenge, as I've seen it, is this tends to be larger banks. I've worked for years with Commerce Bank, actually, out of St. Louis, because they know the ins and outs. But they have floors. I mean, they have minimums, project amounts that they're willing to invest in. So I think that certainly there should be some discussion with community banks and other institutions in the state. I think there needs to be a conversation there about what the barriers are. But again, you have to, you've got skin in the game, right? If you're basically investing in your community, you're taking an ownership percentage in order to take advantage of the tax credits. And it's not as fruitful an investment as a lot of other things you might invest in. But my hope would be that there would be a way for community banks to participate, but it's an issue of risk. And then sometimes you're lucky if you're in a community with one community bank. And in that case, if they're the bank that's financing your project, they may see a conflict in also participating as an investor in tax credits. So my answer is yes. I'm not a banker or financing whiz, but from a developer standpoint and someone who's been involved in these incentive programs for many years, I'm sure there's a way to do it. Right now, it's not working.
Representative Baker, you have a question?
Mr. Chairman, Christy, thank you for coming today. I'm a huge believer in this program. Obviously, it's been wonderful for our community and for Cottonwood Falls also. We've seen development there. But I also see it in Salina, Manhattan, even here in Topeka over on Kansas Avenue. I know downtown Newton, Hayes, lots of these communities have had some development with this program. So my question is, can you walk us through the process? How do we find an old building? What qualifies it? And what's the difference between an old building and a historic building? And when the building's completed, what are the use restrictions there? Can we rent the thing out? Can we live in it? Kind of help clear the air on a couple of those questions, please. Thank you.
I should stress that the rehab tax credit program, unlike neighborhood revitalization, for example, but it is restricted to historic properties. With the state rehab credit, the property has to be listed on the state register of historic places. The projects also have to meet a lot of stringent requirements because, you know, you all are stewards of taxpayer money, and you're not going to throw money out for a, you know, cracker box building. These are properties that are listed on the National Register of Historic Places, either individual or state register, either individually or as contributors to a district. So, I mean, Hayes, you're very familiar with. I was the preservation consultant on most of those projects on Chestnut Street, and was very proud to be involved in that redevelopment. That would not have happened without the rehab tax credits, and also, I'm sure, Neighborhood Revitalization Act program. So the state has a historic preservation policy, and it is in part, the preservation programs are funded in part through the National Park Service. They have a process for identifying potential historic properties throughout the state. And in Topeka, I mean, Representative Baker mentioned Topeka, they have really stepped up. I, at one time, was the chair of the Topeka Landmarks Commission, and it's changed a lot since then. They've really stepped up to try to identify properties that are potentially eligible for listing so that they can qualify for incentives, because again, these properties require a lot of investment. In Council Grove, for instance, we have a historic district, so does, you know, Chestnut Street District in Hayes. Properties are identified as either contributing or non-contributing within the boundaries of that. And I can think of several right now that are distressed properties. You know, buy a building. Generally, if you have to finance a rehab, of course, you have to go through an appraisal process, which can be daunting in a rural community because appraisers just they don't have comparables. And then, you know, in my case, it's enlisting a good historic preservation architect, planning a project that meets preservation standards, because with the rehab tax credits, those are reviewed by the State Preservation Office to make sure they're meeting preservation standards. And then you don't get the tax credit until the project's done. I mean, you have to show that you have a complete project that meets preservation standards on a historic building. So it's most often used in downtowns, and many of our rural communities are beginning to have some historic districts. That's something that's taken off in the past several years, but that's kind of the process for identifying. And then again, the projects have to meet strict preservation standards. It doesn't mean that you can't use the building for a new use. I mean, you've seen that in Hayes. You have a building that was built for an auto garage, and you know, you convert it into a restaurant. I mean, that kind of thing happens all the time. There's a way to, well, I'm thinking of Dodge City too, actually, with the, I'm sure many of you have seen the distillery there. That was a tax credit project. So you have a building that was a municipal building converted for use as a distillery. So that's pretty common. I mean, the expectation is you're going to have a new use. But if we were looking at a room like this and we were rehabbing, we wouldn't come in and rip out all the woodwork and plaster and start from scratch. I mean, there's certain things that you have to maintain in order to qualify for the credits. And I'll tell you, sometimes that alone can be a barrier in a rural community, because sometimes these are small I mean, you can make a huge dent in a building in downtown community for, you know, in some cases, like, you know, $20,000. You're not going to pay a bunch of consultants to get you what you need to qualify. I mean, these are for major, investments. So that kind of gives you an idea. Did that answer your question, Representative Baker?
Thank you.
Right.
And well, we've got, I think, 2 more questions, and then I see that our next presenter has come on, so we'll want to get to them. But Representative Hsu, you had a question?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. First is a request of research. I would love to learn a little bit more about the Heritage Trust Fund and the changes that we made a couple years back, and if, you know, just everything with that. So if they could do that, that would be wonderful. My question is, I guess, more of a broader observation. I spend a lot of my time thinking about how to keep young people in rural Kansas, or getting young people to rural Kansas. And one thing that struck me looking at your testimony was potentially the power of language. So looking at just a couple of your points here, right? There's historic tax credits, there's neighborhood revitalization, there's heritage, which is probably a name of something, but it's heritage, and those are all somewhat backwards looking, right? Pastwards looking things. Revitalization is you're still looking at the past. And so I'm wondering if, I don't know, I think young people are drawn to ambition. I think young people are drawn to the new and exciting thing. And then I don't know if it's worth looking at just, you know, renaming some of these to be a little bit more forward looking. What is the best version of these rural communities that can be? It might not necessarily look like what it used to be. But just kind of a stray thought, and then I'd be interested in your thoughts on that as well.
I will tell you, as someone who is trained in museum administration and historic preservation, the last thing the world needs is another museum. There is a fine balance. I mean, I'm not talking about, you know, creating curios, and I think Hayes is a great example of that. There is a way to invest energy and excitement into a community by rethinking what is already there. That doesn't mean there's not room for new construction. That doesn't mean that, you know, you have to restore everything as if it's the White House. That's not the approach. I mean, most of the projects that we work on, and these terms, just so you know, many of these programs, of course, came out of the historic preservation community, and they're terms that are kind of part of that language nationwide. But, and partly too, to kind of restrict, you know, so that with neighborhood revitalization, new construction, of course, qualifies as well. But what I'm seeing often, and I'm sure you are too, when folks are attracted to a rural community, part of it is the authenticity of place. And a lot of that is, you know, oftentimes a quaint downtown. It's a place where, you know, there's activity during the day, and that kind of thing tends to happen in a downtown. The other thing is with the state rehab credit, that helps leverage some federal funding, and that federal funding is also tied to historic designation. But of course, it doesn't exclude. I did a project where, you know, I started with a building that had a plastic front on it. And in that case, it was technically a restoration because we recreated a pressed metal front, but we painted part of it purple. You know, I mean, we made it funky. And so I'm a huge supporter of that. I think that good design transcends time. There's a place for contemporary design. And many of the projects that we're working on now actually are, you know, I'm thinking of the Fox and Hayes, are mid-century. They're fantastic examples of mid-century that we can really work with, you know, and create contemporary uses for. So I agree with you as somebody who's interested in vibrant rural communities. The truth is that when you invest in existing buildings, you get more of a return on your investment, and you get a better quality construction. If I couldn't, you know, I can buy a building in downtown Cottonwood Falls for maybe $5,000 or $10,000. And then, you know, I had to put a lot of money into it to rehab it, but you couldn't even build a Butler building for that. You know, so you're starting, using existing buildings is, you know, it's environmentally sustainable. It's also financially sustainable as well, especially in rural communities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Christy. And is it a short question, Representative Watson? Okay, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. How many of these small communities have historic districts? If I recall, it was difficult to get.
It is. I mean, it is a challenge. I think one of the challenges is that we have, you know, in our larger communities, like Topeka, for example, there's a historic preservation program at the local level. They're able to access funding to survey and identify these things. Many of our rural communities have begun to identify historic districts. Other communities, they don't want it because there's a perception of regulation. Council Grove, I did the historic district nomination in, I think, 2010. Cottonwood Falls, where I live, there's not the political will for that because there's a concern, of course, about regulation, whether that's real or not. But I would say more and more, but the emphasis tends to be on larger communities because they have the funding and infrastructure to pay for the kinds of studies to identify these things and establish them. There is beginning to be some more happening in Northwest Kansas, in part through the Dane Hansen Foundation. That's just an extraordinary boon, I think, to Northwest Kansas. But I would say more and more, but there's so many communities that would be eligible that aren't.
Don't do it. All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
And thank you very much, Christy. I appreciate all of your answers and all, and I think maybe as we move forward in the rural development part, may have a wish for you to come back again and visit about some of the things that you've mentioned today and other ideas that our committee could look at that would be a doable type of thing in a shorter period of time. So appreciate it very much. Thanks for taking the time.
Thanks.
Well, this second part of our presentation, and I see it looks like they are ready to go, is a vaccine update from KDHE, Secretary Lee Norman, and he has some experts with him, and we appreciate your offer to make a presentation to our committee today, and welcome, Dr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, committee. Can you hear me okay, Representative Kelly?
Yes, very well.
Well, I'm in my office alone, so I can do it without a mask, so I hopefully can be heard well. In another separate room, I've got a fellow, Phil Griffin, who heads up our immunization program. I'm going to give the presentation. He's always very helpful for answering questions with some details that I may or may not have. If the person who's the host of the meeting could put up our slide deck, I would appreciate it very much. I've got a few things I'd like to show you.
Dr. Norman, I was trying to get you solo on our screen here in the building, but we've got it on the computers. So.
Oh, okay. Okay, so I'm not in big screen. Who is the host of this, sir, so that I could see if we could get the slide deck that I have prepared showing?
Yeah, this is Gary Warner. I've got the slide. Let me see if I can get it on the screen.
Thank you, Gary. And if you could walk through it once we get it up there. Let me start off while he's doing that, Mr. Chairman and committee, to say that this has been quite a remarkable, very good. That's slide number 2. Maybe you could. There we go. Okay, and if you could, can you make that a bit bigger? If not, we can probably live with it. By way of introductory comments, I just wanted to say that one, our incident command team 24/7, 365 has been stood up now for about a year and 4 weeks. We saw this coming early on and organized ourselves around it. This has been a major effort, as you well know. Let's see. Overall, this has been a story of shortages. We've had plenty of disease, COVID-19, very much a real disease. Thank you very much. That's getting there. And when we think back of how we've gotten here today, remember a year ago we had the shortages of PPE. At the same time, we had shortages of testing equipment and testing reagents, shortage of case investigators and contact tracing individuals. Hospital beds, we were short. Hospitals, in some parts, were close to being overrun. Shortages of staff members. We had so many people that became ill as healthcare staff. Therapeutics, the antibodies. You may remember when President Trump was hospitalized, he had gotten the bamlanivimab and then the antibody cocktail. We've had shortages of that, but now we're pretty flush in that and we're being used statewide. Patient transport, we were short because there was so much need for moving patients, particularly from lower acuity settings to tertiary care settings with great critical care medicine. And now finally vaccine. The rest of these things that I just ticked off We've pretty well gotten through. Hospitals have very few COVID-19 patients now. The staff are back. The staff are all vaccinated, at least all of them choose to be vaccinated. And the numbers are improving. We're seeing a decreasing number of cases. We're seeing decreased number of hospitalizations, decreasing deaths. And if you look statewide, the percentage of positive tests of all the tests that are taken, by the way, we've done 2.5 million tests on Kansans. We're now down to about 5% being positive. So that's a good sign. Next slide, please. I have a number of slides. Some of them are a little bit busy, but I'm just pointing out a couple things on each one of these because I want to be respectful of your time. I was planning on, Mr. Chairman, about 30 minutes, give or take, for this presentation and to make sure we have time for.
We have until 10:30, Dr. Norman, so we've got plenty of time.
Oh, okay, good. Okay. A couple things I'd like to show you here. One is that this at the upper left, www.kansasvaccine.gov is a treasure trove of material there. You can, if you look down at the bottom in that little blue bar, this little golden color says learn more. If you go to that kansasvaccine.gov and click on learn more, it has all the statistics for where a vaccine's going county by county, how many doses have been given, gender, age, and that kind of thing. So you can see how we're doing throughout the state of Kansas. I think is important. Next slide, please. One thing I will say is that as we've gone around, we were up in Pottawatomie County yesterday doing 267 teachers. We're going to be doing a mobile vaccine to other communities here yet this week. We're seeing and have gone through all the healthcare personnel in the state, and we have a lot of happy faces. You can't see them sometimes because they're behind masks. But there's a box from Lindsborg where when they receive the vaccine from us, they put it into what they call their box of hope. I think on balance, I mean, you might hear things to the contrary, and we'll talk about things to the contrary about a few speed bumps that have occurred. It's been a very positive experience for the state of Kansas with 2 so far and third one coming online soon, vaccines. Very, very good vaccines, and hopefully that will provide lasting immunity. Next slide, please. This is the 23rd of February, so that's just a little bit old now. No, those are updated numbers. That's perfect. If you look in that left-handed box, 483,000 doses have been given. We've been delivered to the state of Kansas 600,000 doses of vaccine, and that's an 80.4% administration rate. So 8 out of the 10, there we go. 8 out of the 10 doses that have been sent to us have been given to Kansas. And I'm going to put it right up front. We have had a little bit of a data problem in that we have so many vaccinating sites now. Many are new, and have not yet become accustomed with how to upload the information when of who they've given vaccine to. So this is a low number, I can guarantee you. We are in the process now of solving this data management issue. These are low numbers of 483. I'm sure we've given more than that, and I'm going to talk about that in a couple slides from now because the data is really important. I'm sure you and your constituents want to make sure that we're not holding a vaccine in inventory, and we're not. Except for maybe a clinic to be done next week or so, or we give first doses, then we will of course hold the second doses in inventory when it comes close for the person to get their second vaccine. Next slide, please. We've had real good growth in terms of the doses allocated in Kansas. Early on in the first few weeks, we had about 45,000 doses a week. And that's driven up now to, you see, we're looking to the middle of March to have upwardsly of 143,000 doses. We had no delivery into the state of Kansas last week, and many states didn't get any because of the weather. Both at Pfizer and Moderna, the 2 companies that are now supplying vaccine, did not have the pickers and packers to pack them in the cold storages, and then the airplanes weren't flying out of Memphis and Kalamazoo and other places. So we this week are going to be real flush in it and doing some scrambling throughout the state to get vaccine into people's arms, because we'll get the vaccine that was supposed to come to us last week will come this week along with our usual doses. We started on the right-hand side there. Phase one was residents of long-term care facilities, senior housing, assisted living, and then of course healthcare workers. And we're through phase one. There's a few long-term care residents and staff who have to get their second dose yet, but everybody that has wanted a dose of the vaccine, either residents or staff, have gotten it. That's 88% of the residents have chosen to get it, and about a little lower than that, 68% of the staff members have chosen to be vaccinated. We would hope for that to be higher, and we're going to keep encouraging vaccination of the staff because we don't want them to put themselves at risk or, of course, their residents at risk either. Next slide, please. We're in phase two now, by the way. This is and you can read it on your own, but I wanted to point out we've been having Pfizer, which is a 2-shot series, Moderna, a 2-shot series, and the FDA, I think they maybe will recommend approval of the Johnson & Johnson, a 1-shot series of recommended emergency use authorization. This weekend, it'll be looked at, I believe, by the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices of the CDC. So we could be starting to get vaccine from Johnson & Johnson. Well, actually, we'll get it from the federal government, but get the Johnson & Johnson in even a week from now. Could come that soon. They aren't going to be a high volume of a producer of vaccine as the other two. So it's not like it's going to flood the state with more vaccine. The J&J product will have the advantage, again, of just being one dose. Doesn't have quite the effectiveness profile, probably in the mid-70s% effective. But the thing that's important to remember with all these vaccines, including the Johnson & Johnson, is that yes, it's a goal to prevent the illness, but even if it's a little bit less effective and a person gets an illness, they're typically very effective at preventing severe illness, hospitalizations, and death. Rather like the influenza vaccine, no vaccine is 100% effective. Influenza vaccine, a really good one would be 70%. And I've said for 42 years of medical practice, I've never seen an immunized patient with influenza die of influenza. They might get sick with it occasionally. Saying the same things. COVID-19 is a completely different infection. And I have high hopes that all three of these will not only cause immunity and reduced harm, but provide durable immunity. What does the future hold for these guys? I think we can look at it and say, well, it'll probably get booster doses like we get influenza now, probably on a yearly basis. No, we don't know that for sure yet because we'll have to study the science of it to see how much durability of the immunity there is. So next slide, please. I want to point this out. You've heard about Operation Warp Speed. It started in the Trump administrations, managed by the Department of Defense. The research and development that led to these has not been at warp speed. That's been going on since 2003 with SARS. What has occurred in warp speed is the production and distribution is what's going at warp speed. And I bring this up because I think there's people out there that are uneasy with the idea that anything would be injected into their body that was developed at warp speed. And I want to, every time I can, I try to combat that notion that there's that this is an experimental drug or it was put together too quickly. And I have a lot of confidence in the research and development that led to this. The production and distribution has been at warp speed, or quick, I might say. Next slide, please. Speaking of distribution, this is how the vaccines come to Kansas. Up on the upper left, the vaccine manufacturers make it. They push it out to distributors who then push it out to administration sites or occasionally a national depot. That's where the drug goes. It has to be cold managed, which has been a difficult one with Pfizer because it has to be kept at 70 below 0 centigrade, which is extremely cold, not well colder than a normal freezer. So there's been a little bit of nuances with that, but we've managed that. If you look at the lower left hand, not to be ignored, ancillary supplies, as much as it doesn't necessarily seem obvious, you can't just push the vaccine out. You have to put out with needles, syringes, alcohol swabs, et cetera, because when we're doing 50 to 100,000 or more of these a week, those aren't trivial. And it was a fine point. So we put those kits, you see kitting there at the lower left. We put those kits with syringes and alcohol and whatnot with the vaccine so that the vaccinating sites have that. We found something early on that you might find curious. We certainly did, and it's very important. And that is the syringe that was chosen really mattered, because with one type of syringe on a Pfizer vial, a vial of the vaccine would get 5 doses. A different syringe would get 6 doses, and sometimes even a 7th one. And those are all good doses. But imagine 1/6 or 1/7 that would go to waste just because of a different syringe. So the devil is truly in the details on these, and we wanted to really make sure that we didn't lose any of the vaccine product because of a syringe that wasn't optimal for the job, and that's been fixed since the very start. Next slide, please. Vaccines are allocated across different counties, and if you look on the right-hand side there, initial allocation based on phase 2 population. Phase 1 population, we knew how many healthcare workers, how many long-term care patients, or I should say residents and staff there were. But so now that we're in phase 2, it's based on population and with a small modifier called social vulnerability index. There are some counties that have higher mortality, more poverty, there's 17 different indicators that would push people into a higher risk category. So there's a little bit of that social vulnerability index put into the calculation, but essentially you can think of it as per capita basis vaccine. A couple fine points. Oh, could you go back to that slide, please? There we go. The graph is pretty telling. It's obvious that the number of doses you see there color coded, the higher populated ones have more doses, even though the same per capita computations being done, and the lower population counties have fewer doses, but the same per capita dosing. What we have done, and you might have heard about this from your constituents, is some counties might only get 100 doses a week, for example, and that might even be twice what they need. So they might be requesting 50, but we can't break up they come in kind of like pizza boxes, these doses. You can't break them up. So somebody might get 100 doses one week and 0 the next week, because what they really need is to have 50 a week. The other thing is some counties, because of this same allocation, have gone faster through phase 2. So on occasion, we will put on a bi-weekly basis so that the counties continue to move, so that the state continues to move through phase 2 somewhat the same. We can't fine tune that too much, but we think it's better to have the whole state move ahead about the same pace, because keep in mind, it's risk-based. We want to get the highest risk people vaccinated first. It wouldn't make a lot of sense to have the well individuals, very low risk individuals in one part of the state being vaccinated when we have people very high risk in other parts that are yet to be vaccinated. So we try to load level that. It's a little bit of a challenge, but I think we're getting better at it week by week. Next slide, please. The providers, we started off with in the hundreds, 300 to 400 providers, because that's all the vaccine we have. If you look at those bar graphs down at the bottom left, we're now, as of last week or so, over 1,000 different kinds of providers who are vaccinating sites. And if you look at the right, there you can tell what kind those are. We originally started off with the goldenrod color, the local health departments and hospitals, and some of the federally qualified health centers, i.e., think of it as safety net clinics. But as we get more and more vaccine, we will become more reliant on community pharmacies, which are already starting up. Last week was the first week, maybe it was 2 weeks ago, of the retail pharmacy program that the federal government delivers to directly to pharmacies. More on medical practices, medical groups. And then, of course, we'll continue with some on a regular basis, of course, to local health departments. Brings up the point that one of the reasons why we're getting more to the state in general is because the program vaccinated the long-term care through the federal pharmacy partnership. Once they finish their work, they're sending it over the fence to us to deliver through this allocation process that I'm going through. Next slide, please. This is a real critical slide, and because where do these priority groups come from, you ask? And this explains why some people are higher priority, why healthcare persons and long-term care, for example, are higher than somebody in phase 2, for example, a 65-year-old or 75-year-old. The first sentence up there, clinical outcomes and death. We know certain groups are more likely to become ill and have bad illness and death. And then there's some of this is setting based. Where did the person live or work? Residents and staff, proximity. If they cannot control their distancing, residents and staff, for example, in nursing facilities, hard to stay 6 feet away from others. And the next one down is type of contact. You can see, for example, that in the example I'm using is exposure to droplets, shared surface, and common items. Compare a preschool teacher who's mopping up kids' noses and cleaning up after them and cleaning surfaces all the time. Compare that preschool teacher or elementary teacher to a college professor where they have great distances between them, maybe you're remote a fair amount of the time. Those two are dramatically different in terms of their risk of the illness. Contact duration, 10 minutes or less is the people who, if you think of 10 minutes or less, it's kind of like two ships passing in the night. You're not at great risk if you're just passing like through an airport by somebody or something like that. But if you're like, again, a preschool teacher or an elementary teacher, you're in very close approximation, and it's always going to be greater than 10 minutes. So they kind of, greater than 10 minutes, shared surfaces, and not farther than 6 feet away. And then finally, challenges and hard to implement what I call engineering or protective measures. You're indoors confined, it might have old air handling systems and the like. A good example of that is meat packers. Early on in this, it was apparent that, and we're still very cautious with the meat packing industry because some things have been controlled better with plexiglass between workstations and the like, but some of those things can't be necessarily controlled. So the setting makes a big difference. Next slide, please. I won't spend a great deal of time with this. This is the prioritization. We're now in phase 2, as you've seen. Again, Kansas vaccine.gov has this, and then has every one of these categories defined and described. For example, there's always a little bit of questioning about what is a congregate setting. What is meant by that? Is a dormitory a congregate setting? Is a nursing facility for sure is a congregate setting? And then what is a severe medical risk? That will be in the next phase, et cetera. So that's on our website. We didn't just make this up. It looks a lot like what the CDC recommended. We did some fine tuning. But we also, when it comes to infrastructure, like there was some debate. For example, we made the decision to put wastewater treatment workers, which are a fairly small number, we look around the state, or drinking water treatment workers as a high contact or critical worker. Because what happens if you have too many people going down with illness in wastewater or drinking water? I don't have as hard of a time making that argument, seeing what's gone on in Texas since last week, of the critical nature of that particular infrastructure, i.e. water. That's where these things have come from. By the way, when you look at stage 5, it serves as a reminder, I should mention to you that we don't have any vaccine that's approved for individuals under the age of 16. One of the two we have is approved for 16 and older, one is for 18 and older. The studies are being done now on children. We have had children ill, of course, and die. The youngest death we've had in Kansas from COVID-19 is a 6-year-old. That was just recently. Actually, it was in the fall. Let me correct myself. Next slide, please. No, go, yeah, there we go. I wanted to point out, oops, one more up, please. In the dark blue box, it says National CDC Vaccine Finder in development. It actually, I need to update that slide. It went online, I think, on Monday of this week. The people who do vaccinating, the vaccinating sites are required to report in each day how much vaccine they have. This is not a new program. Vaccine Finder has been around a long time. So if you were going to go to Botswana or something and you needed to get a yellow fever, you or your provider would go into Vaccine Finder and find out who had yellow fever. It's essentially the same thing with the COVID-19. We know how much vaccine we're distributing, and this way we can keep track of how much is in inventory. Next slide, please. And in addition to that Vaccine Finder on our website, the Kansas, oops, one slide up, please. It seems to be kind of finicky, doesn't it? It looks like on the left, you go in and put your zip code and it gives you who are vaccinating sites are within whatever distance radius you choose. And on that orange URL there, the ks.gov, find my vaccine will help you. Now, it'll tell vaccinating sites, and at any given moment in time, they might or might not have vaccine, but it'll give you as a user either information how to click on their website to register for it, or if it's, for example, a small health department, a phone number you can call to get on a waiting list, et cetera. And it doesn't have all the vaccinating sites that there will eventually be. We feel it doesn't make a lot of sense to put 1,000 on there that don't have vaccine yet, but that will become more robust as we get more vaccine in the door. But the shortages of vaccine have limited how easy or difficult it is to find vaccine for an individual. Next slide, please. Pretty straightforward. I suspect many of you in the room or here on virtually have been vaccinated. After you find the vaccine and get the first vaccine, and then of course you sit down for 15 minutes, 30 minutes if you've had prior allergic reactions to something, but 15 minutes, make sure you're fine, and then you head out. Might get a little side effects have been pretty minimal, really. The soreness and maybe a little bit of achiness or chills, but usually people have breezed through it. Second dose, either 21 or 28 days later, or I should say no sooner than 21 and no sooner than 28 days later for the second dose. Sometimes people get a little bit more achiness in their arm or chills after the second dose. And then you consider yourself not fully protected until 2 weeks after the second dose, which is why, of course, we're still on the far side. You see, we're still recommending wearing a mask and avoiding close contact because, yeah, the vaccine should prevent you from becoming ill. Does it absolutely, can we guarantee that it's going to protect you from becoming infected or transmitting it? No, not really. Eventually, things will be much more loosened up, but I think for a while, until we really see the effect on our population, it's going to be important for a while to have some of the same infection control measures that are in place now, even after you've had the second dose. And I might point out, we've had no influenza this year to speak of. A few cases here, a few there. I was on with a group of critical care doctors today, a very large group, and nobody had even a single case of influenza in their intensive care units this year yet, which is really unusual. And why is that? It's because we've been wearing masks, social distancing, et cetera. It absolutely works. Next slide, please. I mentioned we've had a little bit of a data issue. I have confidence that of the 483,000 doses that are registered as having been administered, I absolutely know that those have been administered. But there's some that show out there that they're in inventory and not yet given, but have been, but we know have been given. We're trying to fix this with a workaround. we have the state mandated, you may remember it was a statute passed a couple years ago that requires vaccinated sites to use the WebIZ, the bottom line. Started this past July 1 as a requirement. We've been using WebIZ as our registry for a long time. It's a good system, but it does require an HL7 interface. Without getting into computer gobbledygook, some are not adept at this yet. We're doing a workaround and in the process of cleaning it up. The result of this is it shows that even at an 80.4% administration rate, it has us as one of the lower ones in the bottom third of the country. And we know we're not down there. We know we're someplace higher up than that, but we'll fix it. Next slide, please. And this is, you might want to bookmark this site. It's the, you see in the blue box, CDC COVID data tracker. It's an interactive map, and you can go in and hover over any state, Kansas included. And this is where, to me, this is a little embarrassing because of that data glitch. It has us farther down on the list than where we really are. So I want to fix it so that it's accurately depicted on this. But this is a data tracker, which is quite good for many reasons, including the how successful we are at administering the vaccine. Next slide, please. A few remaining slides, Mr. Chairman and committee, and then we'll open it up, or if you choose, you do whatever you wish, but I'll open for questions. Slide, please. You see there, we dropped that down, but we're back up to 80% again. We dropped down during that week where there was no vaccine delivered. So that, and I mentioned we're doing a workaround. We're doing a daily snapshot with every vaccinating site so we can find out real time how much have you given and how much is in inventory. And then the next one is once we find that out, we'll find out who has problems with this HL interface and go in and fix the data. But you can see the trend line on the left, with the exception of the week the planes weren't flying. We're getting better all the time at getting the percentage of immunizations injected into people's bodies. Next slide, please. The peach colored one is the one that we're kind of hysterically focused on at any given moment. That is what we're trying to solve for with the workaround and HL7 fix to find out what is in that inventory box, because there'll always be some. The vaccinating sites will always be holding the second dose for people who've had their first dose, and there'll always be inventory if they get it on Monday and they aren't going to be vaccinating until Thursday. Then of course they'll be holding those in inventory. In cold storage in inventory. So some of that will always be there, but we know that there's some that's listed as in inventory, but we know has been given. We're hunting those down now. Next slide, please. The long-term care facilities that you see on the left there in the box, that the residents, 49,000, have chosen to be vaccinated. The staff a little lower. So again, it's about 88% of the residents and about 68% of the staff, and that's the total number of boost and prime doses. Prime doses, by the way, is the first dose, and the boost is the second dose or booster dose. And there's two kinds of long-term care facilities. Well, actually, there's many kinds of long-term care facilities, but broadly speaking, there are the CMS, Center for Medicaid and Medicare Services, regulated ones that were a part of the federal program. That's on the left side, and on the right-hand side is all the other ones. These are ones that are between KDADS, who licenses and inspects those. We, working with KDADS, had to go out and find those because they were not part of the federal program. And we have pretty well tracked everybody down that's in those kind of onesies and twosies. There's still a few that we're trying to get a hold of because we may not know about them, and it might be a group home, for example, of 6 individuals that live in a group home. What we're really, I want to provide assurance to you that it's almost like being an investigator to go out and find where everything is, because it's not something that we have optics on, but we want to match up their needs, these long-term care, or they could be for intellectually and developmental delayed individuals, et cetera. We want them to be vaccinated too. We're trying to track them down. Next slide. And then just recently, we started a couple weeks ago, on the 8th actually, started the Federal Retail Pharmacy Partnership. The feds push vaccine directly to the retail pharmacies. We went through and a lot of them are household names, Walmart, Dillon's, Kroger, you know, those kind of CVS, Walgreens, et cetera. The one you may not know, if you look at the right-hand side, the little boxes at the bottom, there's that light colored CPESN. That's one of the, that's a consortium of independent pharmacies. And the reason I bring that up is because many of you in your rural counties will not have necessarily a Walmart or a Kroger or a Walgreens or a CVS, but you might have a locally owned and operated one. They're highly likely to be members of the CPESN network or consortium. We want to make sure those get coverage too, because that'll be a conduit for getting vaccine into those counties as well. And indeed, the feds were good at working with us and having them be part of the provider group. If you look at the far right of those little boxes at the bottom, MHA and GeriMed are two chains that deal specifically with pharmacies. Because one of the questions you might ask is, how do we know going forward that long-term care facilities will continue? Because the federal program's done, it's stopped, essentially. We will want to work with these pharmacies that are already servicing these long-term care facilities, for example, to make sure that they continue to get vaccine. It's our belief that ultimately, as more and more pharmacies come on board, you remember an earlier slide that had a history, had the bar graph that showed pharmacies as the the largest number of vaccinating sites out of the 1,080 or so different sites. Pharmacies represent the largest number, not necessarily largest volume, but largest number, and they're very important for geographic distribution. You'll see here, obviously, that the Kansas City metro area and in Wichita metro, of course, have the highest clustering of pharmacies, but we want to not turn a blind eye to the rural counties as well. Next slide, please. Okay, that is the end of the slideshow. You can turn that off if you choose, Gary. Mr. Chairman, I'll turn it back to you and the committee for any questions you might have.
Dr. Norman, we do have questions. Representative Hoheisel, if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I do have two questions, if I may. The first one, thank you for being here, Dr. Norman, in that presentation. I know you've given this repeatedly, but I don't serve on any of the committees you've given it to so far, so this insight in this presentation is helpful. My first question is, I represent Southwest Wichita and Sedgwick County, and talking with folks down there, we're having an issue getting vaccinations into the arms of our law enforcement community. I know I believe they're in phase 2, but they're not being prioritized right now. We're prioritizing teachers above them, which I'm fine with. Getting vaccinations into teachers' arms is very important. Can you kind of give some thought process on that, though, is why they're on the back end of phase 2?
Well, that's a local decision, Representative Hoheisel. We consider them first responders, and we did put EMTs and paramedics in phase 1. They're first responders, yes, but they're also medical, doing medical things all the time. They're now we're squarely in phase 2. Your county can move them up or down, and I'm not trying to dish it off on them, but we do feel that every county and every region has a little bit different mix, and mostly the county commissioners and especially the local health departments have a feeling for how to best meet the needs of their counties. So we don't try to overly prescribe that. If we had it our way, of course, we would flood your county with vaccine and do everybody on the same day, because we do have the high capacity in Sedgwick and many areas to do mass vaccination. We defer to your local authorities, sir, on that.
Thank you for that. And my second question, if I may, Mr. Chair. In our predominantly African-American communities, we're seeing polling now nationwide of a distrust, of a hesitation to get the vaccines. Are we doing anything on the state level to reach out to these communities to let them know that this vaccine is safe to take? Are we taking any steps to reassure those folks?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's also true in the Hispanic Latino populations as well. And we're doing some grassroots work. May know Ed O'Malley and the Kansas Leadership Center. We've been contracted with them for a lot of community conversations. We are also doing work involving people of color. And we are also starting, I think it'll roll out next week with African American, Hispanic, Latino, and other populations that are less likely to get vaccinated or less trusting, have specific working groups working with and collaborating with those individuals. Like tomorrow, for example, I'll be doing a Facebook Live with Audie Negrete and of the Kansas Hispanic and Latino Commission, excuse me, and a physician, a Latino physician from Southwest Kansas. Because we all recognize that there is disparity, and this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion is really important. And it's about collaboration, and it's about getting people talking about this that look more like they do, and they have friends, relatives, faith leaders, and others. So it's a very broad-based effort. There's an organization, a firm called Sprouts that is working with us, and we're going to start doing more public service announcements and the like that are targeted towards specific populations as well. We're not keeping up with the African American population in terms of, if you look at the percentage of Kansans who are African American and the percentage of African Americans who should have the vaccine, we're lagging. On the Hispanic Latino population, the vaccines and testing is about equal to the percentage in the population. So we're paying a lot of attention to that. And it'll take a lot of groundwork, quite honestly, and meeting them in their places. We're doing testing, for example, in churches as well. And we feel the closer we get to a person's community, the more likely they are to be trusting of the individuals that they're hearing this from.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Norman, and I do appreciate us putting emphasis on getting that taken care of. So thank you, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Representative Shu?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Lee, for being here. I was wondering if there was, with the pending potential authorization of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, it functionally works very different, and the efficacy is very different compared to the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. I was wondering if there's going to be a separate strategy just for those. I assume at, 66% efficacy, we don't want to put those in the arms of like the 80+ population, right? And so I was just wondering, we're not just going to slide the same vaccines all in the same dosage to the same people, right? There's got to be a separate strategy for the Johnson & Johnson.
Yeah, real smart question. Thank you for that. Yes. One of the things that we're looking at is to say, what is the advantage that having only one dose provide, and look at populations that would benefit. For example, we know that homeless persons, we know that incarcerated individuals, or people in, let me rephrase that, in jails, who might literally be in the jail today and then back out on the street tomorrow. A lot of these mobile populations would probably be a terrific benefit in having a one-dose sequence. But we are working on this exact question. It's like you're a mind reader. We were dealing with this exact question this morning, along with our state and territorial health officers. There's one of us in each state, to find out what are people thinking? How are we going to give this? There are some people that will choose it just because they might be able to get it sooner than a Moderna or a Pfizer. But I would rather, and first off, I do not want people to feel like they're getting a lesser vaccine because of any value judgment we're putting on them as a person, but rather to say how best to customize that person for this kind of product. And if they want it sooner rather than later, then they might be able to get the Johnson & Johnson sooner. That's not a great reason to select it, but I think we're going to probably, well, first off, there's not going to be very much of it because they're not a high production vaccine, but I think it's really going to hover around the question of who would benefit by having only one vaccine, because one for them is better than none, particularly on very mobile populations.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Representative Lynn?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a couple questions, if I may. I've had the benefit of hearing this a couple times, so I get new information each time I hear it. One of my questions, on slide 5, you mention, or you have a chart that says, and I did the math, 43,000 people who've received the first dose have not received their prime, or their booster, I should say, the boost dose. So at what point will we start bumping up those boost doses to make sure that there is adherence to the vaccine, as far as, vaccine adherence, they're receiving that second dose in time?
Yeah, good question. Mr. Chairman, if I may, I'd like to introduce Phil Griffin. He's the guy that really is the point person in the allocation and the holding back, if you will, or I should say the scheduling of the second dose. And I would like Mr. Griffin to respond to that if it's okay with you, Mr. Chairman.
That is perfect. Go ahead, Mr.
Phil.
Griffin.
Morning. The boost doses that I think are being referred to there they're out at the site level, and the health departments or hospitals or FQHCs, whoever is doing the prime administration is also following up with those for the boost doses. So those boost doses arrive in most cases the week prior to when they are due, and they work to get the people back. It depends on each individual site as to how they actually schedule that. Some have the schedule set up when the person gets their prime dose. Others do a callback system as they arrive, but those boost doses are out there. And then there is always a certain percentage of people that are hard to track down, do not come back for a variety of reasons, don't show for their appointments, and they continue to reach out to try to pull those in. While the doses are scheduled to be ideally within 4 days of 21 days after the prime dose for Pfizer or 28 days after the prime dose of Moderna, there is good data and CDC statements of going out as far as 42 days after. So there's a window of time in there they're trying to get those in.
Okay, and if I may follow up, okay, because on the graph it says that this is the number of doses allocated to Kansas. So that would suggest to me that all of the allocated doses are included in those numbers. So it sounds that we would be behind, but maybe I'm reading it wrong.
All of the doses that are allocated are ordered immediately upon allocation each week. And they come out, the boost doses come out at that 3 or 4 week interval after the prime, and actually the week before that. And as soon as they're out, we order them to match the prime doses that are already out there.
Okay, may I ask a second question?
Yes.
Thank you.
Representative Lynn, the other way I think about it is that the allocation that Phil is talking about is what the federal government is allocating for us, and then we order it so that the local vaccinating sites can match up the second dose with the first.
Okay, thank you. Then I did have another question then on what data is being collected for the infection rates of those who were previously vaccinated or the reoccurrence of a second infection in Kansas or throughout the U.S.? Is someone compiling that data?
We do. We keep that in what's called EpiTracks, and we know if a person with a positive test has had either naturally occurring illness or previously vaccinated. So we are accruing those data.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair.
And that's true at the CDC, excuse me for interrupting, that's true at the CDC level as well.
Okay, and Representative Bergkamp.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Dr. Norman. Sort of unrelated, but related. Do you guys keep track of the annual flu shots that Kansans get?
We know that, Phil, Mr. Chairman, Phil heads up the immunization and keeps those numbers. May I have him give that answer to the flu shot?
Certainly.
Phil.
And the answer, they are to be reported into WebIZ. Again, this is the first year of the full mandate for all vaccines to be reported in after July 1 of last year. So up until that point, no, we would not have had full data. Since that point of July 1 of last year, we should be receiving all vaccination data for flu vaccine every year.
Is that available to us online then?
It's not something we've published at this point. I'm certain we can make it available based on the data that we have. I will say, like with most things, there's not 100% compliance yet. You know, we know that and find that in any of these situations, but have certainly been working to work with providers to assure that they are reporting.
Thank you.
Representative Day?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Dr. Norman, for your presentation. This is the first time I've heard it, so I appreciate it. So we've had reports. I had a couple of questions, but because of time, I'm just going to cut it down to this one. We've had reports of the data glitch now in our reporting of vaccines administered for a few weeks, it seems like. And I'm just wondering when you anticipate that that's going to be on track and how soon we can see that changing. I know it's tough to get everybody to comply, but we sure would like to have those numbers correct. Thank you.
Oh, yeah. I tell you, I've worried about as much about that as any single thing during the course of this pandemic, because I am always interested in being accurate. We just on Monday started the workaround, Monday of this week. We had an HL7 expert in, and who's still here working with us to try to understand. But what we realized is we needed ground source data from each and every vaccinating site, that it wasn't something working with the manufacturer of the WebIZ, the company, that we needed to have ground truth by having every vaccinating site every day reporting to us then about 4 or 5 data elements. And then on the ones where we find discrepancy, we will go in and have an individual consultation to figure out where the glitch is. I would like to think that even within a week or two, that we would have our diagnoses in place. Phil is probably rolling his eyes, but because I'm such an optimist, but I think that in a couple of weeks, we'll know where the problems are so that we can really fix them.
Representative Wassinger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Norman, I have one is I've seen a lot of reports that said that 1 dose is enough for a lot of people. It's been online in different news organizations. And then the second is, I can't remember what my second one is, but the first one was, why wouldn't we vaccinate everyone that wanted it and then do the second doses?
Yeah,
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a really good question. And we have debated it, really saying, can we get to 70% effectiveness with 1 dose of uncertain duration of effectiveness, but get to twice as many people? That has been debated. And we haven't, as a nation, I don't know of any place that has chosen to do that. And partly is because it's not FDA approved to use in that manner, among other things. It's kind of it's almost an ethical question too, which is how is the greater good being served? And I'll agree with you, Representative Wassinger, we've debated it, but have chosen to stick with what the FDA has approved the use of the medication for.
Dr. Norman, one final question that was rolling around in my mind as you talked about this. In the long-term care facilities and maybe in the prison populations when you're there, the staff members that have chosen not the lower 68% and 88% of the residents, can you reach the herd immunity and those type of centers with not everyone being vaccinated?
Herd immunity doesn't really start kicking in until about 85 or 90% of immunity. So it would probably make it more of a risky environment for the residents and for the staff, for that matter, to have it be anything below that. So no. Can we push it down to the low, quite a low, without going too deep in the science, the R sub naught, the infectivity factor, if it's less than 1, it'll eventually die out in theory. And that's when you get to 80, 90, 95% immunity rates. But and we're down below 1 in the state of Kansas, down below 1 in the state of Missouri, so we're getting obviously more control over it. But no, there's always greater risk in unimmunized. And I recognize this is a controversy. And I was a hospital CMO, at chief medical officer at KU and others before, and we required influenza vaccine, not a very popular thing to do, but feeling it provided the safest environment. And I'm not necessarily weighing in one way or the other on whether it should be required or not, but it's not a safe an environment when a population is at 68%, no.
Well, Dr. Norman, thank you very much for taking the time, answering all the questions for us today, and I'm sure there's a couple more that could be asked, but we want to respect your time, and we're about to at our ending time, so thank you very much for scheduling this with our committee, and good luck as you continue on your quest to conquer COVID in Kansas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Representative Lynn, I apologize for you to having to tolerate me for 3 times. But thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Norman. And one final thing before we take off. We have, you've been sent the minutes from 6 of our meetings, January 13th, 20th, 25th, 27th, February 1st, and 3rd. And we haven't had any notice of any corrections to be made, but would like to have a motion to approve these minutes. Have a motion from Representative Hoheisel, second from Representative Shue. All those in favor, please signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Minutes are approved. And committee, our next meeting likely to be Wednesday, March the 10th. So a ways away. Thanks for the great first half, and we are adjourned.